What if the most shocking truth about Christ's return was never hidden in Jerusalem at all? What if it was preserved far from Western theology, far from church councils and prophetic charts, guarded instead in a land most of the world was taught to overlook? High in the Ethiopian highlands, there exists a biblical tradition older than Rome, untouched by the Vatican, and anchored in manuscripts the Western world never translated. This is not speculation. It is not folklore. It is scripture, as Ethiopia has guarded it for centuries. And according to that scripture, Christ will return, but not through the gates you were taught to watch. The Ethiopian Bible speaks of mountains, not temples, of covenant carried, not rebuilt, of Zion that moved quietly when the ark moved with it. They believe the ark of the covenant never vanished. It was relocated, and where it rests, heaven will touch earth again. If God's presence traveled with the ark, and the ark left Jerusalem, did God leave too? And if so, where has he been dwelling all this time? So before we begin, I want to ask you, what if everything you believed about the end times was wrong? Type that in the comments. Let it sit with you. And if you're ready to explore the truth buried under centuries of silence, hit the like button, subscribe, and come with me. For centuries, the story of Christ's return has been told as though its geography were already settled. Jerusalem has been treated not just as a historical center, but as the unavoidable destination of prophecy itself. Western theology assumed that because Christ ascended from there, he must return there. The assumption became tradition. The tradition became certainty. But Scripture never states that prophecy must remain fixed to one location forever. What if the problem is not that prophecy was misunderstood, but that it was incomplete? Far from the councils of Rome and the frameworks of Western doctrine, another biblical tradition has existed in silence. Not revised, not reinterpreted, preserved. High in the Ethiopian highlands, a Christian faith developed without the influence of empire, untouched by later theological reforms, and anchored in texts the Western world never fully received. This tradition does not deny Jerusalem. It simply does not end there. The Ethiopian Bible contains books and interpretations absent from Western canons. Its theology was shaped not by institutional authority, but by continuity passed from generation to generation through chant liturgy and guarded manuscripts. For Ethiopia, Scripture was not something to be systematized. It was something to be carried. And within that preserved tradition exists a claim that unsettles modern prophecy. According to Ethiopian belief, Christ will return, but not through the temples of Israel. This is not presented as speculation. It is treated as inherited knowledge. Their theology does not begin with the end times. It begins with covenant, with movement, with the idea that God's presence is not bound to stone or city, but to obedience and dwelling. Ethiopia does not ask where Christ left. It asks where God remained. This distinction changes everything. Western prophecy focuses on rebuilding on future temples, future signs, future events. Ethiopian theology looks backward before it looks forward. It traces the movement of sacred things. It follows what Scripture says, traveled, not what history assumed, stayed behind. And at the center of that movement is the Ark of the Covenant. If the ark represented the dwelling place of God's presence on earth, then its location was never incidental. Scripture shows that when the ark moved, authority moved with it. Victory followed it. Judgment followed it. Blessing and curse followed it. So the Ethiopian question is unavoidable. If God's presence traveled with the ark, and the ark left Jerusalem, did God leave too? Western theology rarely asks this because it presumes the ark vanished. Ethiopia never believed that. They believe it was relocated, preserved, guarded, and that where it rests, Zion rests. This belief reframes prophecy itself. If Zion is not merely a hill in Jerusalem, but the place where God chooses to dwell, then prophecy cannot be read only through modern maps. It must be read through covenant continuity, through where obedience was preserved when power shifted elsewhere. This is why Ethiopian prophecy does not rush toward timelines. It watches patterns. It does not look for spectacle. It looks for alignment. And it does not assume the return of Christ will mirror Western expectation. Before asking when Christ will return, Ethiopia asks a more dangerous question. What if the world has been watching the wrong direction, not because Scripture failed, but because attention drifted away from where the covenant was quietly kept? That is the piece Western prophecy never looked at. And it is where this story must begin. The Ethiopian claim does not begin with the end of history. It begins with its transfer. At the center of this belief stands a story the West often treats as symbolic, but Ethiopia treats as foundational. The meeting between King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. In Western teaching, it is a diplomatic visit, a moment of admiration, a poetic episode. In Ethiopian scripture, it is something far more precise. According to the Kebra Nagast, Ethiopia's royal chronicle, the Queen of Sheba did not come to Jerusalem for trade or spectacle. She came for wisdom. And what she received was not merely counsel, but covenant. From that meeting came a son, Menelik I, whose significance was not political, but theological. Menelik was not presented as an heir to Solomon's throne. He was presented as a carrier of lineage. Through him, Ethiopia claims direct descent from the house of David, not as symbolism, as bloodline. And with that bloodline came responsibility. Because in Ethiopian theology, covenant is not inherited by proximity to power, but by obedience to what was entrusted. When Menelik came of age, he returned to Jerusalem. And this is where the story diverges sharply from Western comfort. According to Ethiopian tradition, Menelik did not return empty-handed. He returned with the Ark of the Covenant. Some texts say Solomon consented. Others say the transfer occurred without his knowledge. Ethiopia does not argue over method. It focuses on outcome. The Ark left Jerusalem, and it did not wander. It was brought home. This is not framed as theft. It is framed as preservation, as fulfillment of a divine shift already underway, because Scripture itself shows that God's presence has never been permanently tied to a single city. Eden was lost. Shiloh was abandoned. Jerusalem was destroyed more than once. Ethiopia argues that covenant survival required movement. If the Ark was the seed of God's presence, then its relocation meant something far more serious than political loss. It meant spiritual transfer. Authority followed obedience. Zion followed dwelling. God did not abandon Israel. He continued his covenant elsewhere. This is why Ethiopian theology does not wait for Zion to be rebuilt. It believes Zion already moved. Zion in this view is not defined by walls or geography. It is defined by where God chooses to remain. And Ethiopia claims that choice was made quietly, away from empire, away from corruption, and away from spectacle. That belief reorders prophecy. If the covenant moved, then expectation must move with it. If the Ark was carried south, then attention fixed solely on Jerusalem becomes incomplete, not wrong, but unfinished. And this is the tension Ethiopian scripture preserves. Before Christ returns, Scripture says, what was carried must be accounted for. What was entrusted must be located. And what was preserved in silence may speak last. If this challenges what you were taught, pause for a moment. Like the video, share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe not for views, but to stay attentive as this unfolds. Western history teaches that the Ark of the Covenant vanished, that it disappeared after Jerusalem fell, that its fate is unknown, buried beneath ruins, or destroyed by time. This assumption shaped theology for centuries. Ethiopia never accepted it. In Ethiopian belief, the ark was never missing. It was never hidden because it was never lost. It was transferred, guarded, and kept exactly where covenant demanded it remain. The ark, they claim, rests in Axum, not displayed, not examined, not debated, guarded. At the heart of Axum stands a small chapel beside the Church of Mary of Zion. Inside, according to Ethiopian tradition, is the Ark of the Covenant itself, not a replica, not a symbol, the Ark described in Scripture. And it is watched over by a single guardian. One man, chosen for life. He does not leave the grounds. He does not grant interviews. He does not allow photographs. He does not confirm or deny to outsiders. His role is not to prove the ark's existence, but to remain faithful to it. He eats there. He prays there. He dies there. This silence is intentional. In the Western world, sacred objects are placed behind glass, studied, displayed, and debated. In Ethiopia, sacred things are withdrawn, not because they are weak, but because they are holy. The ark is not treated as an artifact of history. It is treated as a living presence. This difference matters. If the ark truly represents the dwelling place of God's presence, then it was never meant for spectacle. Scripture shows that those who approached it improperly suffered consequences. Ethiopia's silence is not avoidance, it is reverence. This is why Ethiopian faith does not revolve around proving the ark to the world. They do not invite archaeologists. They do not seek validation. Their conviction does not depend on recognition. They behave as though the ark is still active. During Timket, Ethiopia's most sacred festival, priests carry replicas of the ark through the streets, not as reenactment, but as acknowledgement. The celebration does not commemorate a lost object. It honors a present reality. The movement reflects belief, not memory. This creates an uncomfortable contrast. While the West searches caves, tunnels, and ruins, Ethiopia kneels. While theories multiply, Ethiopia fasts. While debate continues, Ethiopia guards. And beneath that silence lies a question Scripture itself demands. If the ark remained central to God's presence in the Old Testament, if it determined victory, judgment, and divine nearness, why would God allow it to vanish without purpose? Ethiopia answers plainly. God did not allow it to disappear. He allowed it to move. And if the ark moved, then the center of divine attention moved with it. That does not negate Jerusalem, but it challenges the assumption that God's dwelling remained fixed there. This belief does not shout, it waits, and it forces prophecy to slow down. Because before asking how Christ will return, Ethiopian scripture insists on accounting for where God's presence has been dwelling all along. If the ark still rests in silence, then silence itself may be part of the sign. And if that is true, then what has been guarded quietly for centuries may speak only at the moment it was always meant to. Not to the loudest watchers, but to the most attentive ones. If prophecy depends on timing, then the way time is measured matters. Western Christianity reads the return of Christ through the Gregorian calendar, a system shaped by Roman authority, papal revision, and historical correction. Dates are counted forward. Timelines are charted. Seasons are treated as linear progress toward an endpoint. Ethiopia does not share that framework. The Ethiopian calendar runs approximately 7 to 8 years behind the Western system. To outsiders, this appears like a technical discrepancy. To Ethiopian theology, it is deliberate. Their calendar was never reformed, never adjusted to empire, never synchronized with Rome. It is rooted in older sources, texts like Enoch Jubilees and ancient scriptural traditions preserved in Ge'ez. These texts do not treat time as a straight line. They treat it as sacred rhythm. In Ethiopian belief, time does not simply pass, it aligns. Each year carries spiritual weight. Each cycle reflects divine order. Most importantly, the Jubilee cycle every 50 years is not symbolic. It is active. It marks release, restoration, and return. This matters because Scripture repeatedly emphasizes appointed times. Not random moments, not human calendars, but seasons God Himself establishes. Ecclesiastes says there is a time for every purpose under heaven. Ethiopian theology takes that statement literally. Here is where the tension deepens. Many Ethiopian scholars believe the return of Christ will not align with Western dates or feast calculations. It will align with a Jubilee year on Ethiopia's calendar, a moment when sacred time and divine action converge. This does not produce date setting. It produces watchfulness. Western prophecy often asks, how close are we? Ethiopian prophecy asks, are we aligned? If the world is operating on a different clock than the one God set, then signs may appear meaningless. Events may feel random. Attention may drift. Ethiopia suggests this spiritual disorientation is not accidental. A people who kept sacred time would recognize sacred moments. A people who abandoned it might not. This is why Ethiopian Christianity does not obsess over end-time spectacle. It focuses on rhythm fasting cycles, feast days, liturgical repetition. These are not traditions, they are calibrations. The claim is unsettling. What if the delay many perceive is not delay at all? What if the countdown was never tied to modern chronology? If Christ's return is governed by divine timing, rather than institutional calendars, then the question is not, why hasn't He come? The question becomes, who is still keeping time the way God appointed it? Ethiopia believes it never stopped. And if sacred time has been preserved there, then prophecy itself may be reaching a moment of alignment. The wider world is not prepared to recognize, not because the signs are hidden, but because the clock being watched is wrong. That is why Ethiopian scripture does not rush the end. It waits for the moment when time itself says now. Ethiopia's claim to prophetic significance is not built on power. It is built on endurance. For centuries, Africa has been treated as the margins of history, conquered, exploited, silenced. In Western theology, suffering is often interpreted as absence of favor, absence of blessing, absence of divine priority. Ethiopian scripture reads it differently. In their theology, suffering is not abandonment. It is refinement. Ethiopia stands as a paradox. A nation never fully colonized, yet repeatedly invaded. A people surrounded by collapsing empires, yet holding to ancient texts when others discarded theirs. Faith was not preserved through dominance, but through pressure. Scripture supports this pattern. Psalm 66 declares that God tests His people as silver is refined. Ethiopian belief does not treat this metaphor lightly. Refinement requires heat. Purity is not achieved through comfort. This perspective reframes history. Slavery, exile, and humiliation are not interpreted as divine rejection, but as preparation. A people stripped of empire cannot confuse power with presence. A people forced into endurance learn how to dwell without spectacle. Ethiopia believes this mattered. While theology elsewhere evolved through councils and institutions, Ethiopian faith matured in isolation. Books were guarded. Liturgies remained unchanged. Fasting was not seasonal, it was foundational. Covenant was practiced daily, not defended intellectually. Within Ethiopia's lesser-known apocalyptic texts appears a recurring theme: the return of divine light to a land long darkened by suffering. This is not framed as vengeance. It is framed as reversal. The light does not return to the powerful. It returns to the prepared. This belief did not remain confined to Ethiopia. Across the African diaspora, echoes of this theology emerged. In places shaped by displacement and oppression, Africa was remembered not as lost, but as central. Ethiopian tradition suggests that readiness for Christ's return is not measured by theological sophistication, but by faithfulness under pressure. Those who endured without recognition learned to wait without demand. This challenges modern expectation. Western prophecy often assumes readiness is tied to knowledge charts, signs, interpretations. Ethiopian scripture suggests readiness is tied to refinement. A people shaped by suffering are less attached to outcome and more anchored in obedience. If Christ's return is not merely an event, but a revealing, then those refined by fire may recognize it first. Not because they suffered more, but because they learned how to remain faithful when nothing was visible. Ethiopia does not claim suffering makes it superior. It claims suffering made it steady. And if endurance is part of preparation, then the land that endured quietly may not be peripheral to prophecy at all. It may have been positioned deliberately. Waiting. Western prophecy looks forward to construction. Ethiopian theology looks to preservation. For much of the modern world, the expectation of Christ's return is tied to a future temple, one yet to be built, measured, and sanctified. Plans are drawn. Materials are discussed. Attention is fixed on what must rise. Ethiopia does not wait for that moment. According to Ethiopian belief, Zion is not unfinished. It is not pending approval. It already stands not in marble or gold, but carved directly into the earth. In the highlands of Lalibela, 11 churches were not built upward but downward, cut from solid rock, hidden from the horizon. No scaffolding, no mortar, no imperial sponsorship. Stone removed, not added. What was created was not meant to dominate the landscape, but to disappear into it. This matters. These churches were carved during a time of invasion and threat, when Ethiopia faced pressure to abandon its faith. Instead of fortifying walls, they dug deeper. Instead of building monuments to power, they created sanctuaries of presence. Ethiopian theology calls this Zion, not because of location, but because of intention. Zion in this tradition is wherever God chooses to dwell, and God chooses dwelling over display, presence over prestige. This reframes the idea of a third temple. If the purpose of a temple is communion rather than control, then Ethiopia argues the mistake is assuming God is waiting to return to stone. The temple was never about architecture. It was about nearness. Psalm 68 declares that Ethiopia will stretch forth her hands unto God. In Ethiopian worship, this is not poetic language. It is enacted. Old Testament festivals are still observed. Fasts are still kept. Covenant is lived, not reenacted. The churches of Lalibela are not tourist attractions in their theology. They are evidence of continuity, proof that worship never stopped, that God's dwelling was never abandoned, only relocated away from empire. This challenges expectation again. If Zion is already active, then prophecy does not require rebuilding. It requires recognition. If God never left, then the return of Christ is not about restoring what was lost, but revealing what was kept. Ethiopia believes the world is searching for signs in ruins, while missing the sign that has been alive all along. Zion does not rise with noise. It endures in silence. And if Christ returns to where covenant was preserved, rather than where power once stood, then attention fixed solely on future construction, may miss the present reality. This is the unsettling claim, that while the world waits for Zion to appear, Ethiopia believes Zion has been praying continuously hidden, carved into stone, waiting not to be built, but to be seen for what it already is. Still standing. Ethiopian scripture does not describe the return of Christ as an interruption of history. It describes it as an unveiling. In Western expectation, the second coming is imagined as an arrival from outside clouds, parting heavens, opening a dramatic descent into a world unprepared. Attention is fixed upward, waiting for something to break in. Ethiopian theology looks inward before it looks upward. According to this tradition, Christ does not return to where covenant was abandoned, but to where it was preserved. His return is not an invasion of foreign ground, but a revealing of a dwelling already kept. The emphasis is not on spectacle, but on recognition. This distinction is critical. If covenant never ceased in Ethiopia, if worship continued, sacred time was kept, Zion remained active, and the ark was guarded, then Christ's return would not feel unfamiliar there. It would feel like continuation, like a presence stepping fully into view rather than descending into absence. This belief reframes the question that has shaped prophecy for centuries. Instead of asking, "Where will Christ come from?" Ethiopia asks, "Where has he been remembered?" In this view, the return of Christ does not begin with the world's attention. It begins with alignment. Those who kept covenant would recognize him not because of signs in the sky, but because his presence would not feel foreign. This theology echoes quietly through the African diaspora. In the 20th century, movements like Rastafari did not invent Ethiopian significance, they inherited it. Haile Selassie was not declared divine by Ethiopian Christianity, yet his lineage traced directly to Solomon and David. His coronation titles came from Scripture. To many, he was not fulfillment, but signal, a reminder that bloodline covenant and endurance still mattered. Selassie himself rejected worship. "I am but a man," he said. But the symbolism surrounding him endured. Ethiopia remained unconquered. Faith remained intact. Sacred time continued uninterrupted. To those watching closely, it appeared that something had been preserved while the world was distracted elsewhere. Ethiopian scripture suggests that Christ's return will not validate power. It will expose faithfulness. Not everyone will recognize it at once. Not everyone is meant to. Jesus himself warned that the days preceding his return would resemble the days of Noah's life, continuing as normal attention divided significance unnoticed until the moment passed. Ethiopia takes that warning seriously. If the return is a revealing rather than an arrival, then it will not announce itself to those looking for spectacle. It will be recognized by those who remained aligned. This does not mean Ethiopia claims ownership of Christ. It claims responsibility. Responsibility to guard what was entrusted. Responsibility to keep time when others adjusted it. Responsibility to worship without interruption. And if Christ returns to a people who never stopped preparing, not with fear, not with calculation, but with endurance, then the shock will not be where he appears. The shock will be that he was never as far away as the world assumed. The final question remains unanswered intentionally. What if the second coming is not about Christ traveling back to humanity, but about humanity realizing where it drifted from him? And if that is true, then the most important piece of prophecy was never missing. It was waiting quietly where covenant was never forgotten. If this message caused you to pause and reflect, leave your thoughts in the comments below. Like this video and subscribe to the channel, not for views, but to remain attentive as scripture and history continue to converge. Thank you for staying with this message.